Okay, good evening. How many of y'all were here 2 weeks ago? Okay, so 2 weeks ago, one of my examples, I talked about jobs I had in college. And one of them was breeding fruit flies. So my wife was sitting right here, and Tammy Sanders was sitting next to her. And my wife tells me after the service, Tammy leans over to her and says, "How does he tell the boys from the girls?" Tammy Sanders, elder's wife, wants to know how they tell the boy fruit flies from the girl fruit flies. So Jimmy, is your wife here tonight? I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She'd probably be ashamed to be here anyway. Anyway, so I thought, okay, you know, if one person in a class, when you're a teacher, if one person asks a question, usually it means at least 10 more people are thinking that. So I don't know how many more of y'all were thinking that. But I thought, okay, we'll just tell you how we did that. So fruit flies are about a 1/16 to an 1/8 inch. So they're very small. They're a little bit bigger than fleas, but they're a lot smaller than house flies, so they're really hard to see. So we would breed them in these quart jars and have a cloth over them that they couldn't crawl through, but yet air could get in. And we would feed them with honey or fruit. You know, fruit flies like fruit. Anyway, so after they hatch out, you got all these flies buzzing around there. So you have to there's different characteristics of them, so you have to breed them. And so to make more for our little experiments in the biology department there at the college. So, ether was used, 100 years ago for general anesthesia in people. It was kind of the first general anesthetic. So we had ether in a bottle, and we put a few drops of ether in the bottle, and that would put them all to sleep for a while. Seriously, they'd put them to sleep. And then, we'd have have a real bright light, and on a table, we'd dump out the fruit flies that were sleeping. And then we had a magnifying glass, because you got to be able to see the fruit flies. So this is how you could tell the difference between the boys and the girls. So you look down, and those boys were all wearing leather jackets, and the girls were carrying pom-poms. There you have it. Okay, now you know. Okay, all right. On to the Bible now. Okay, so we're into 2 Samuel. We've been going through the book of Samuel. Always do a little bit of review in case you're not here with us the last few weeks, and also to kind of segue into tonight's lesson so it makes more sense. At this time, David is in his latter years as king of Israel. He's probably in his mid-60s. He's been king of Israel for about 30 years now. His oldest living son is named Absalom, and Absalom has decided that he should be king. So we read how over a period of about 4 years he conducts this very calculated political campaign, and the Bible says he stole the hearts of the people. So after he knows that he has the backing of the majority of the people, he actually goes down to Hebron, goes south to the capital of the tribe of Judah. David and his family were from Judah. And so he gathers an army in Hebron, and word comes to David in Jerusalem that Absalom is coming with this mighty army, and David does not want to subject Jerusalem to a siege or an attack. And so David and his family and David kind of has an army of about 600 mighty men that are his very loyal supporters, and they're very highly trained, but they're certainly not enough to fight Absalom's huge army. So they leave to the east. So go ahead and bring up that map. This is the map we've used now for several weeks to just remind you where we are. Okay, so here's Hebron down in south in Judah. That's the capital of Judah. So Absalom's there, and then his army's coming up north to Jerusalem. David and his supporters and family leave to the east. They cross the Jordan River. Here's the Dead Sea. There's the Jordan River coming down from the Sea of Galilee up here. And we know that they cross the Jordan River, then they go north and they end up in a little walled city called Menahem. So kind of keep that in mind as we go through the story tonight. So we read how David, before he left Jerusalem, set up a very intricate intelligence system. It was really pretty interesting, kind of a spy network. We read how when he left Jerusalem for a whole day, a man named Shimei, who was a supporter of Saul previously, so he was a political rival, I guess you'd say, or he was from the different political party than David was, and so he was mad that David was king and didn't like David being king. So for a whole day, while David and his group go 20 miles, Shimei is right next to the group throwing rocks and dirt and cursing David for a whole day. Then we read about David's response to Shimei, and we studied how that was exactly the same type of response that Jesus had to his hecklers around the cross. Then last lesson in chapter 17, we saw how God's sovereignty worked. Sovereignty means you have the power and authority as a king, and how God's sovereignty worked was seen in that chapter. We saw that God's sovereignty worked covertly behind enemy lines. You know, verse 14 of chapter 17 said, "The Lord had determined to frustrate Ahithophel's good advice to Absalom in order to bring disaster to Absalom." So God has determined that Absalom's rebellion is not going to succeed. You know, just like parents and grandparents work covertly in the entrance of their children and grandchildren. If you have children or grandchildren, you know how this works. You do things for them to make things work out good for them, and they may not be aware of all that you do for them. And God's sovereignty works the same way with us. You know, I think we personally will never know all the ways that God works behind the scenes covertly to work in your favor and my favor. Second way we saw God's sovereignty work was with certainty. Absalom had chosen to be an enemy of God's anointed king, who was his father David, and that sealed his fate. And so today, any person who chooses to be an enemy of God's anointed, who is Jesus, has sealed their own fate. So God's sovereignty works with certainty. And the last thing we saw was the compassionate nature of God's sovereignty, how so many people came to help David and the people he took into Menahem. We just read several verses of stuff. They brought foods and goods and things that they needed to survive. And so that's the compassionate nature of God's sovereignty, because it often works out through us, because God's children serve as his hands and his feet, his ears, his tongue, and we can show God's compassion through the things that we do for others. Okay, so tonight we start chapter 18. David now mustered the men who were with him and appointed generals and captains to lead them. He sent troops out in 3 groups, placing one group under Joab, one under Joab's brother Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and one under Ittai, the man from Gath. And so David and his men are in the city of Menahem. He realized that Absalom's army has come, and he's getting ready for the battle between his group and Absalom's group. We did learn last week that God had countered the advice of Ahithophel, Absalom's great advisor, and so Absalom chose to believe Hushai, who was David's spy, and Hushai suggested to Absalom that he take time and collect men from all over Judah to collect a huge army to go after David, rather than following Ahithophel's advice, which was to go after him quickly. Because Hushai knew David needed time, and that it would take time for Absalom to collect men from all over Judah. There was no rapid means of communication back then, so it was all person-to-person communication. So this allowed David time to collect a better army himself. We don't know the numbers from 2 Samuel, but Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, says that David had collected about 4,000 men from all over Israel who were still supporting him, and they came to Mahanaim to support his army. So David divides his army into three groups. Joab, who's main general, is over one of those groups. Joab's brother Abishai is over a second one, and then Ittai, who we read about in the past, was over the third part. So once more when I read this, I thought, David was a great king. He was a very terrific military strategist. But you ask yourself, why was he in this situation to start with? Why was he here? And it's because he was not so great a husband and father. That's why he's here. That's why he's facing his own son rebelling. And we have that problem today. A lot of us men, let's talk to the men a little bit. God did make us men to be providers, but it's so easy for us to get caught up in doing our job in an excellent way, to be proud of our job as providers. That we're more likely to study how to be a better provider, to work at it, to learn from others, to be successful, then often our wife and kids kind of get the leftovers. Just because we're good at our job doesn't necessarily mean we're good at being a husband and a father. Men don't mind going through job training at work, because then you can be better worker. Might get a promotion, might get a pay raise. But it's hard for us to believe that we need training to be a better husband or a better father. Okay, verse 2 through 5. The king told his troops, "I'm going out with you." But his men objected strongly. "You must not go," they urged. "If we have to turn and run, even if half of us die, it will make no difference to Absalom's troops. They will only be looking for you. You are worth 10,000 of us, and it is better that you stay here in the town and send help if we need it." Then David answered, "If you think that's the best plan, I'll do it." So he stood alongside the gate of the town, and all the troops marched out in groups of hundreds and thousands. And the king gave his command to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai, "For my sake, deal gently with young Absalom." And all the troops heard the king give this order to his commanders. So first of all, David tells the troops, "I'm going to go with you." His men wisely convince him to stay behind, because in ancient warfare, it wasn't which army killed the most of the other one, it was which army killed the king first of the other side. I don't know if any of you play the game of chess. In the game of chess, you have the king, queen, and all these other army men, and who wins is who kills the king of the other side. It doesn't matter if they still have all their men. If you kill the king, you win. And that game of chess is hundreds and hundreds of years old, and it was based on how battle was fought back then. And so the men are saying, doesn't matter if we live or die, they just want you, because that will decide the battle. So David says, "Okay, I'll stay." Okay, the next thing we'll talk about is, why did David tell Joab, Abishai, and Ittai in the hearing of the troops, "Be gentle with my son Absalom"? Now, if you were fighting this battle, if you were one of the troops, if you're one of these generals, and the whole reason you are there to fight this battle, risk your life knowing that a lot of you are going to die, is because this son Absalom has been decided that he wants to be king, and he's done this campaign and got the country behind him, and now he's coming with thousands of troops. He's going to kill you and kill the king, and yet your king says, be gentle with my son Absalom. You know, that'd be like in World War II, you know, one of our generals saying, now y'all, you know, attack Germany, but be gentle with Hitler. Or go to, you know, Iraq and say, you know, fight a good war, but, you know, don't touch Saddam Hussein. You know, if you're a troop, you're thinking, just a minute here. He's the whole reason. He's the threat. He's the whole reason we're here. Here's the whole reason we've run and we're hiding and getting ready for a big battle. We're outnumbered. Why be gentle with Absalom? But what is David thinking? Now put yourself in David's spot. I mean, this is a hard chapter. This is a hard story. David's thinking, I know he's leading a rebellion against me, but he is my son. I love my son. You know, maybe some of you parents have walked a mile in David's shoes, or many miles. Maybe you've had children who have totally rebelled against your authority, have wreaked all kinds of havoc in your life. But, you know, no matter what they've done or what they've said about you or how they've used or abused you, you know deep down you still love them because they're your children. They're your flesh and blood. And that's where David is. Can you see the challenge he's having here? And then on top of all that, what's David thinking? This whole situation is really my fault. He said, you know, after I committed adultery with Bathsheba and killed her husband, Nathan the prophet came to me and said, you know, you're forgiven. God's not going to kill you for these sins that were worthy of death, but you're going to have some earthly consequences. And one of them was the sword is never going to depart from your house. And David's thinking on top of that, when Amnon, who was my oldest son, raped Absalom's sister Tamar, and I did nothing to Amnon for punishment. That infuriated Absalom, so that he waited 2 years for me to do something, and I did nothing. So he finally took it upon himself and killed Amnon. So if you sum it up, David's thinking, how I functioned as a husband and a father is why I'm standing here today facing war with my son Absalom, so it's really my fault, not his. Now, that's his thinking, I believe. And so he's blaming himself for this rebellion. So I think in this time where he says, be gentle with Absalom, he's really struggling with regret over his past. I know he knows that God has forgiven him of his sins. But you know, that's like us, isn't it? You know, we do something really stupid. We do some sinful thing, or we hurt somebody, and we confess just like he did. We know God has forgiven us. But it's so easy to not ever forgive ourselves. And I think that's what David is struggling with. So that's the heart of David. Be gentle with my son Absalom. But in the mind of the commanders and the troops, they're thinking, that is a ridiculous request. We're here for war. We're here to save the kingdom, David. We're here to save your kingdom, David. Okay, 6 through 8. So the battle began in the forest of Ephraim, and the Israelite troops were beaten back by David's men. There was a great slaughter that day, and 20,000 men laid down their lives. The battle raged all across the countryside, and more men died because of the forest than were killed by the sword. Okay, go ahead and bring the map up. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so here's Mannheim. There's the town where David and his men were camped in that walled city there. And so this is the forest of Ephraim up above here. So it's a very dense forest. So, as we mentioned before, David had some 600 extremely skilled, kind of like Army Rangers, plus 4,000 other men that had come to help him, whereas Absalom had, gone around collecting men to fight. And usually in these ancient times, when they just went out and collected a lot of people, these were not trained soldiers. They were just people that, guys that were farmers and ranchers, whatever they did, and they picked up a weapon, and here we are. Anyway, so a dense forest is a place where a trained soldier has a lot more advantage than someone who has no clue what they're doing. And on top of that, I think God was, this was part of God's deal. God was going to make sure that David won. God was going to make sure that Absalom lost. And so God's hand was in that forest. One of my favorite commentators is Matthew Henry. Maybe you've heard of him before. Matthew Henry lived, and he wrote his commentaries in 1708, before America was a country. He was over in Britain. And you think about it, I think, how did this guy get all this knowledge? I mean, I think he was truly, God led him to a lot of knowledge, because his commentaries are some of the best ever sold. You can still buy them new. I can just picture him, this is 150 years before electricity, so he was sitting there by oil lamp or candlelight writing this stuff out. Anyway, this is what he said about these verses here. He said, "What refuge can rebels find from divine vengeance? The pits, the bogs, the stumps, the thickets, and the wild beasts of the wood were the death of multitudes." He said, God fought for David. Absalom's army found what it was to take up arms with a usurper, who with his kisses and caresses had wheedled them into their own ruin. Where are their rewards? Where are their golden days that he promised them? Instead, they see what it is to believe counsel against the Lord's anointed. So the same is true today, just like we said a while ago. Anybody that believes counsel against God's anointed is not going to end well. And that's what happened to Absalom's army. Okay, verse 9. During the battle, Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a great tree, he got his hair caught in the tree. The mule kept going and left him dangling in the air. Now, go ahead and bring up the first picture of Absalom. Back in chapter 14, when we were introduced to Absalom, it said he was the most handsome young man in all of Israel. It said he cut his hair. It just had tremendous amounts of hair. He cut his hair once a year, and it was so heavy, the hair he cut weighed 5 pounds. I haven't had 5 pounds of hair in my entire life. So he's riding on his mule. He sees some of David's men, and he's running for his life. His hair is flowing. Next picture. It's hard to see, but basically he's running under a tree, and his hair gets caught in the branches, and the mule runs out from under him, so he's now hanging in the tree. So his hair, that was his pride, became his downfall. Just like us, right? If we ever get prideful about something, pride cometh what? Before the fall, right? Right. Something that's not said here, but I think about this a lot. Solomon's watching all this. Solomon is much younger. He was a later son of David and Bathsheba. You know, their first child died. That was one of the three earthly consequences. What the child born out of David's sin would die, and he did. But later, David and Bathsheba had Solomon. So Solomon, we believe, is an upper teenage or early 20s. So he's somewhere around 18 to 22 right here. So you know he's with David. David's got his family. And I'm sure he's in the army. And so, you know, if he wasn't right at this scene, I'm sure he heard about this. But, you know, when he was older, he wrote Ecclesiastes, you know, the words of wisdom. And remember, he said, vanity, vanity, all is vanity. And I wonder when he wrote that if he was saying about Absalom and his hair. You know, here you have a guy who just thought he was the cat's meow, the, you know, woman's dream, and had all this hair, and here he's hanging from a tree by his hair now. Anyway, Deuteronomy 21:23. You may have heard this before. It says, anyone that is hung on a tree is under God's curse. Anyone hung on a tree is under God's curse. This is what Matthew Henry said about that. He says, Absalom hung between heaven and earth, unworthy of either, and abandoned by both. Earth would not keep him, heaven would not take him, so hell opens up her mouth to receive him. Now, you've heard that verse in Deuteronomy applied to Jesus. Jesus hung on a tree, but it wasn't because of his own sin, but he hung on a tree because of the curse of sin of all mankind, so that through his death and resurrection we could be saved. Okay, verse 10 through 15. One of David's men saw what had happened and told Joab, I saw Absalom dangling from a great tree. What? Joab demanded. You saw him there and didn't kill him? I would have rewarded you with 10 pieces of silver and a hero's belt if you had killed Absalom. The man says, I would not kill the king's son for even 1,000 pieces of silver. The man replied to Joab, we all heard the king say to you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, please spare young Absalom. And if I had betrayed the king by killing his son, and the king would certainly find out who did it, you yourself would be the first to abandon me, you know, throw me under the bus. Enough of this nonsense, Joab said. Then he took 3 daggers and plunged them into Absalom's heart as he dangled, still alive, in the great tree. 10 of Joab's young armor-bearers then surrounded Absalom and killed him. Okay, you got a picture of that? So there's Absalom hanging from the tree. So one soldier finds him, but he knows what David said, so he does not kill him, but simply runs and tells Joab. But Joab is the pragmatic general. He knows they're in a battle for the kingdom. And he knows what David said, but he also knows that David's judgment is altered by the fact that he loves his son. But Joab knows if they don't kill Absalom, this rebellion will go on, and David's kingdom may not survive. Now, of course, we know that God's going to make sure Absalom does not make it. So Joab and his armor bearers go ahead and kill him. So, just like we said a while ago, it doesn't matter what happened to the rest of the army. You've killed the leader of the opposite army, so now the battle's over. Okay, verse 16 and 17. Then Joab blew the ram's horn, and his men returned from chasing the army of Israel. They threw Absalom's body into a deep pit in the forest and piled a great heap of stones over it, and all Israel fled to their homes. So the trumpet was the ram's horn. Bring up the picture of the shofar. So this is the trumpets they had back then, makes out a ram's horn. And they would use that and you could hear those for miles. So, you know, they would send messages. So it's kind of like, if you're in the Army, they have bugle calls. In the military, they have bugle calls. And so different bugle calls mean different things. So I'm sure they did that back then, where different shofar calls meant different things, like retreat, go forward. Bugle calls, reveille is sun up, raise the flag, taps is lights out, it's nighttime. There's a whole list of bugle calls. I looked them up so I'm sure they had the same thing. So they blew the horn in a way that the troops knew battle's over, retreat. And so the other army, it said Israel fled. I mean, they knew Absalom was dead when they got that call, so they just ran. They just ran. They knew that they needed to get out of there. Now, it says they buried Absalom and they piled a heap of rocks on him. Okay, you have a picture of that? Okay, this is over in ancient Israel. This is a pile of rocks. I'm not sure if this is really a burial site, but I wanted a picture of what this was. Back in ancient days, and this comes from that cultural study Bible that I've told you all about that I get so much information from, that when you killed an enemy or a criminal, basically how they were buried, they weren't buried in the tomb of their family like everybody else was. You dig a deep pit, you throw them in the pit, and you pile as many rocks and make this big heap of stones. And so in the future, that was to basically say you didn't belong on this earth and you don't belong to any family, you're a bad person. And so if you were walking along and you passed a pile of stones like that, you would pick up another stone and throw it on to add to the curses. And so that would go on as long as that pile of stones was there. So, in other words, a cursed person is buried here. He was a bad person, so we want to add curses to his grave. Okay, verse 18. During his lifetime, the writer contrasts his death with what Absalom thought about himself. During his lifetime, Absalom had built a monument to himself in the King's Valley. The King's Valley is the Kidron Valley just outside of Jerusalem that separates the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem. For he said, I have no son to carry on my name. He named the monument after himself, and it is known as Absalom's monument to this day, which is the day that this was written thousands of years ago. So here you have a guy who's, before he's even king, building monuments to himself. That tells you something about his ambition and what he thought about himself. Now he says there, I had no son. Now we had read earlier how he had 3 sons and a daughter. So we have to assume that obviously those 3 sons, those young sons, have died. Back when we did the series on science in the Bible, we talked about how up until about 1850, half of all children that were born died before age 5 because of disease. Only when we figured out germ theory and then eventually vaccinations and antibiotics, did really children start living into adulthood. Now in our culture today, a child that dies is a terrible tragedy because it's so unusual. But back then they almost expected it. So we have to assume that Absalom's 3 sons have died since he built this monument, because he will have no sons to build one for him. Okay, verse 19 to 20. That'll be on the back sheet. Okay, then Zadok's son, Zadok was one of the priest members. Zadok and his son Ahimaaz were part of this intelligence network that we discussed in the last few chapters that David had set up to help him spy on Absalom. Zadok's son Ahimaaz said, let me run to the king with the good news that the Lord has rescued him from his enemies. No, Joab told him, it wouldn't be good news to the king that his son is dead. You can be my messenger another time, but not today. So Ahimaaz is a close friend of David. He's a young man, but he and his dad are close friends of David. And so he's anxious to tell David that the war's over. Absalom's dead. But Joab, he's a pretty wise guy. He's the top general, and he knows that news will bring great grief to David because it's his son. And David loves his son. Be gentle with my son Absalom. So he's saying, I don't need to send someone that's close to David to act like they're excited that Absalom's dead. He said, you're too close to David. I'll use you for other messages, but this is not the one that you need to do. Okay, verse 21 to 23. Then Joab said to a man from Ethiopia, other versions say a Cushite, "Go tell the king what you've seen." The man bowed and ran off. But Ahimaaz continued to plead with Joab, "Whatever happens, please let me go too." "Why should you go, my son?" Joab replied. "There's no reward for your news." "Yes, but let me go anyway," Ahimaaz begged. So Joab finally said, "Okay, all right, go ahead." So Ahimaaz took the less demanding route by the way of the plain, kind of like around the forest, and ran to Mahanaim ahead of the Ethiopian. Okay, pull the map up. Okay, so now Israel's up here. This is Egypt, Mediterranean Sea. Here's the Red Sea. Cush was this land down here. So it is currently Ethiopia and Sudan. That's why that version said Ethiopian, but it was the land of Cush for centuries and centuries. So you may have heard of that before. The people that lived there were descendants of a man named Cush, who was a son of Ham. Ham was one of the three sons of Noah. So, when the ark landed, the sons of Noah spread out different directions. And so this grandson of Noah named Cush went this direction into northern Africa, and they became the dark-skinned people that we have today. And so when the Bible talks about an Ethiopian or a Cushite, they're talking about a darker-skinned person. Okay, so he runs to David with the news, but Ahimaaz knows a shorter, quicker route, and he gets there first. Okay, 24 to 27. While David was sitting between the inner and outer gates of the town, the watchman climbed to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked, he saw a lone man running towards them. He shouted the news down to David, and the king replied, "If he's alone, he has good news." As the messenger came closer, the watchman saw another man running toward them. He shouted down, "Here comes another one." The king replied, "He'll also have news." The watchman said, "The first man runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok. He's a good man, and he comes with good news," the king replied. So go ahead and bring up the picture. Okay, so this is actually Jericho. But ancient cities often had inner and outer walls. And so that was a two line of defense. And so the outer wall would have gates, the inner wall would have gates, and so it said David was sitting between the inner and the outer walls of the city of Mahanaim waiting for the news, and they had a watchman on the wall waiting for news. And generally, if you had single runners, it was considered good news that the battle went well. On the other hand, if you saw a bunch of people running, it meant they'd been defeated, they were running for their lives. And so single runners meant good news. Just an aside, back when we did the archaeology study of the Old Testament on Jericho, Jericho was not found until the last 100 years or so. They, all the non-believers thought the Bible was just a fable, and that Jericho had never been found, so obviously the Bible was wrong. Well, they found Jericho. It's one of the oldest inhabited cities in known history. And they found that it was built on a hill like this, so the second wall was up the hill. So when the Bible says the Israelites went around it, you know the story, and it says when the walls fell out, it says they went up into the city. And nobody, until they found Jericho and found it was built on a hill, nobody in modern history ever knew why they said they went up into the city. It's because Jericho was built on a hill. Interesting, huh? There's been no archaeological find in ancient Israel that has disputed what the Bible said. And if people that don't believe would just watch some YouTube videos of biblical archaeology, they would be amazed. Anyway, so that's just an aside. No charge for that. Okay, so the watchman identifies one runner as Ahimaaz, and so David assumes his news is good. So obviously, in ancient times, there was a correlation as to who brought the news as to whether it was good news or not. So he said, it's Ahimaaz, it's got to be good news. And then and he beats the Cushite there. Okay, verse 28 to 30. When Ahimaaz cried out to the king, everything is all right. He bowed before the king with his face to the ground and said, Praise to the Lord your God, who has handed over the rebels who dared to stand against my lord the king. What's the first thing David says? What about Absalom? The king demanded, Is he all right? Ahimaaz replied, When Joab told me to come, there was a lot of commotion, but I didn't know what was happening, so he declines to tell the king the truth. Wait here, the king told him, so Ahimaaz stepped aside. So Ahimaaz realizes what Joab was trying to tell him. He's not the person. A good close friend of David was not the person to tell him that they had killed his son when the king had told him not to. So we know from the scripture that Ahimaaz knew what happened to Absalom, but Ahimaaz declines to say. He steps aside because he knows the Cushite's coming. He's just a soldier that David doesn't really know. Verse 31 to 32. Then the man from Ethiopia arrived and said, I have good news for the Lord my king. Today the Lord has rescued you from all those who rebelled against you. What does David say? What about young Absalom? The king demanded, Is he all right? The Ethiopian replied, May all of your enemies, my lord the king, both now and in the future, share the fate of that young man. So the Cushite answers the one question that David wants to know the answer to. What about Absalom? At least he's discreet. I'm sure word back in the army, everybody knew the details. At least he didn't say Absalom was hanging from the tree by his hair and run through with spears and buried in a criminal's grave. He just said, May all your enemies end up like Absalom. But David knew what he meant. Verse 33, the king was overcome with emotion. He went up to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. As he went, he cried, Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. One of the saddest verses in all the Bible. He's overcome with grief for the son who brought civil war and had full intention to kill him. So despite winning the battle and securing the kingdom, David would gladly trade places with Absalom. Wow. A lot of lessons in that story. I try to bring out something. We should never study the Bible just for a story. We need to learn from it. So the two lessons I want to talk about tonight for a few minutes is when we're caught between competing allegiances. When we're caught between competing allegiances. So if you're ever in a position of authority, whether it's in government, whether it's in business, whether it's in any kind of organization, and under your authority is a family member or a close friend you're in a very difficult situation. Because if things are going good, they're great. But let me tell you, if things go bad, you have competing allegiances. You're going to be torn with responsibility and loyalty to the organization versus loyalty to a family member or a close friend. So the question comes, are you going to uphold the organization, or are you going to go with the family member or friend? And you're the person in authority. This is where David was. So it's easy for us to be hard on David, but you got to understand his heart. But you also got to understand his authority, his position of authority. So we've got to be really careful when we put ourselves in those positions, or when we bring someone in under us, whether they're going to work in our business or if we have any choice about the matter. Just be very, very careful about that, because it's a very challenging situation. So David finds himself torn between love for his son and love for his kingdom. But we knew the outcome in the last lesson, chapter 17:14. The Lord was going to bring disaster on Absalom. On your lesson sheet, I have a quote from Ralph Davis, another one of the commentators I really get a lot from. How can David's men deal gently with Absalom when God intends disaster for the rebel? If the kingdom of God is to be saved, then the enemy who assaults the kingdom must be destroyed. God gives no secure salvation to his church unless he brings decisive judgment on her enemies. We must stop praying, "Deliver us from evil," unless we truly desire its destruction. Otherwise, we're like a patient telling the surgeon to deal gently with my cancer. It's part of me. So when we have competing alliances that has to do with spiritual things, if we are God's children, we have to stand for God first. Jesus taught this there in your lesson sheet, Matthew 10:37. And this is really hard. This is hard. If you love your father or your mother more than you love me, you're not worthy of being mine. If you love your son or daughter more than me, you're not worthy of being mine. Competing allegiances. We must always, if we're going to be a child of God, be a part of his family, that's more important than any earthly family, allegiance, organization, business, whatever that we're part of. Tough love will always choose God first. Okay, the second lesson is about grief at the loss of a child. Man, in our culture, this is so hard. This is so hard. It's one of the most life-changing events that a person can endure. If you were at the men's breakfast last Saturday, I wish you were if you weren't. JB gave his testimony about all the emotions he went through after the murder of his 16-year-old daughter. It's incredible. Of course, he and his wife have both forgiven the murderers in prison. You know, our pastor Mike and Carrie lost a son. So I don't know that pain. I don't know that grief. And hopefully most of you don't either, but some of you do. I know other people, friends here in town, that lost children 20 years ago, and they still have not been able to move forward. in a positive way, because it is just, the grief has just overcome them so much. Washington Irving said, "Never be ashamed of your tears." There's a sacredness in tears. They are messengers of overwhelming grief and unspeakable love. So in our lesson tonight, even though that Absalom was a rebel, even though he wanted to kill his father, you see the immense love David still had for him. My son Absalom, my son, my son, if only I had died instead of you. But what David knew deep down was that Absalom had to die for the future of David's kingdom. The son had to die to ensure the furtherance of the kingdom. I don't know if you thought about this. I was thinking, this hit me Sunday morning in church. We know that Jesus wept when he was on the earth in several situations. We know he had emotions. He was the emotions of a human. We talk a lot about the cross and Jesus on the cross. Have you ever thought about how God felt while Jesus was on the cross? Jesus was not a rebel. He was there on the cross for us. But he was being tortured and killed by people who didn't believe him, cursed on. You know, I'm sure God was thinking, Jesus, my son, my son. I'm sure he was weeping because he knew Jesus had to die, just like David knew Absalom had to die. Jesus had to die if God's kingdom was going to survive, right? Now, Jesus and Absalom, their lives don't correlate, but I believe their deaths do. That the death of Absalom had to be done, even though it hurt his father, for David's kingdom to continue. Jesus had to die. It hurt his father, but his father knew it had to happen for the kingdom to survive. That's your lesson. That's your lesson. Tough lesson. Let me tell you, I struggled with this one. But there's a lot in there for us. So in 2 weeks, we'll do the next chapter. Chapter 19, you might study ahead. Okay, let's stand. We'll have our closing prayer. Thank you, God, for this time where we can come together and just soak in your word. See the emotions of these people in the Bible that were just real people like us, that love our children so much, even when they're not the people they should be. Oh God, help us. Help us, God, to always know that we are your children first, that our responsibility, our allegiance lies first with you, and that should be our priority. Even when it is so hard. God, thank you for loving us. Thank you for watching your son be tortured and killed so that we could be your children. We thank you in his name. Amen. Thank you very much.